Hey guys, welcome to Yesterday's Coffee, the podcast where we chat about fitness, nutrition, and business all over coffee that may or may not have been brewed yesterday. Today we're talking about training splits and training frequency. So just to clarify, we're not teaching people how to do the splits.
Yes.
As in like the stretch.
No like yoga happening here.
Yeah, I think Alexa took a second to catch on to what
I was like,
there.
wait a second, what?
But no, we're talking about training frequency. So how
training
often?
frequency. So like, especially when people are very first getting started, they struggle a lot with figuring out how to set up each gym session.
Mm-hmm.
And we've kind of sort of talked about, we have talked about foundational exercises and what moves you should be including, but we haven't really looked at it from like a weekly perspective in terms of like how frequently you should be training different body parts and what body parts you should work together on certain days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it really comes down to where the individual is at in that given time. So you can look at any like professional athletes' workout plan or bodybuilders' workout plan or Instagram models' workout plan, and while it works for them, it's going to be totally different person to person. I think most people know that.
Well, I think that's where people get really caught up in, beginners or even people who are more in that like intermediate category who follow a lot of fitness professionals and do their workouts. They'll see, they'll spend 2 or 3 hours at the gym trying to copy a major bodybuilder's workout, not realizing that that's not really what they need to be doing.
Right.
And it may not actually be super appropriate. Mm-hmm. So, especially if you're a beginner, you don't need to be spending 2 hours at the gym.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it comes down to understanding a little bit of physiology and what your body is actually doing and gaining from these training sessions. So like Alexa said, in your early years of training as a beginner, you're new to this type of stimulus. Your body's not used to a lot of weight-bearing activity. And so because of that, you don't need nearly as much volume. You don't need nearly as much frequency, and you don't need nearly as much variety. Probably one of the biggest issues I see with beginners in the gym is trying to confuse the muscle. I promise you, your muscle's already completely confused when you start doing any sort of weight training.
Oh, it has no idea what's going on.
The idea that you need to start adding in 15 different variations of bench press when you've been working out for 6 months is completely ridiculous. In fact,
or like just mashing together these random exercises that you found all over the internet into just like one super random or like workout, and then you do that every single day of the week that you go to the gym, and then it's like you're building no consistency, and at that point it's like your body has nothing to adapt to, meaning it's not really going to be making any progressive changes.
Mm-hmm. And it's not uncommon to see somebody that's clearly just started working out do like 10 different exercises for 1 or 2 body parts in one day.
Yeah. Or like do like 10 sets of bicep curls as somebody who just started working out.
Yeah.
You don't need to be doing that, and it's probably not benefiting you as much as training smarter would help you.
Right. So let's dive into a little bit more specifics here. So when it comes to a training session, your objective should be to do as much work as needed to create some sort of change.
Yes.
So you don't want to overdo it, because what we're trying to balance out here is stimulus and recovery. So when it comes to making beneficial adaptations in the gym, whether that's building muscle or getting stronger, you need to impose a stimulus on your body. So you need to train it, and that's what these exercises are for. But the other side of that is the recovery.
Yeah. So you need to stress your body enough to promote a positive change, but not so much that it's like throwing your body off completely.
Right.
And creating this environment where it's going to take you a week to recover from one session.
Right.
Now, it's a little different, like the first maybe 2 or 3 workouts that you do after taking a long break or like for the very first time.
Oh, yeah.
You are going to be sore for a longer period of time, but your body should adapt pretty quickly. But if you're consistently finding yourself sore for 4, 5, 6 days after certain workouts that you do that you might have found on the internet or put together on your own, that's not a great thing.
Right. So it is all about striking that balance, because at the end of the day, it comes down to how often can I train this muscle and how often can I recover from it. the more quickly you can repeat that cycle, the faster your progress happens. And so it's not just maybe doing like 3 sets of an exercise or 3 sets of a body part and saying like, oh, okay, I kept my workload low, so I'll recover faster and I'll benefit faster. No, you still have to stimulate growth there. So you still have to push it to the point where it's going to adapt, but then know where that stopping point is so that you can recover from it. So that's where a lot of people will make this mistake of hopping on like a body part split because they see that big bodybuilder following it. And those are 2 totally different situations, because if you're really trying to build muscle as quickly as possible, then you want to be stressing that muscle as quickly as possible. Mm-hmm. And so if you're only hitting it once per week, but if you're training chest on Monday, International Chest Day, and then by Thursday or Friday, it's fresh, but you're not hitting it again until next Monday because of your training split, then you're not going to be able to grow your chest as quickly as possible, or any other muscle group that you're trying to focus on.
Absolutely. Well, and I think the other side of this too, which, we can talk about in a little bit, I guess, is it also is going to come down to your schedule. So I think where you're at in your fitness journey is number one, most important. But then also you have to be realistic with how many days you have available to go to the gym.
Absolutely.
That's going to make the difference between how you set up your schedule. Because somebody doing a body part split has to have, basically 5 solid days to give to the gym, maybe 4 solid days, but, 4+, and be able to make that regular. Because again, it's got to be consistent, because you can't just end up skipping one whole body part every week because your schedule didn't match up.
Right.
You know what I mean? So you also have to be realistic in the time that you can afford to spend at the gym and build your schedule accordingly.
Absolutely. So if we're looking at things from an experience basis, starting with beginners, whenever somebody's brand new to the gym, like I was saying, you don't need tons of variety. You don't need to be switching exercises up every week. What you need to do is stick with foundational movements. So
the ones that we always talked about in our last
bench press, deadlift, lunges, hinges, things that are involving a lot of muscles at one time. And so that you can start practicing those each week, building up your strength in those each week, and getting those movement patterns down. Because you need a basis to build off of. And all these accessory movements that you might see on Instagram or online or whatever they may be, they can be useful in certain situations. But if you haven't built the base from the heavy compound movements that train the majority of your body, then you're not going to be getting nearly as much benefit from the accessory exercises.
No, and especially to decrease your risk for any injury in the future. You have to teach your muscles how to work together first before you ever think about training them separately.
Right.
Because your body, everything is working together every day, all day long.
Exactly.
So why would you spend all of your time at the gym focusing on just separate body parts when that's not really how life works?
Right. Yeah.
So you really want to focus on those foundational movements, those compound movements, for a couple of different reasons. You're going to get the most work done in the shortest amount of time.
So more you're using calories burned.
Yeah, you're using multiple muscles at the same time, meaning more calories burned overall. And then again, it goes back to the frequency of how often you can work a certain muscle group. If most of your exercises contain multiple muscle groups, then those muscles are going to be worked multiple times within the same session, within the same week.
Right.
Meaning you get more work done.
Greater frequency, more work, more potential for growth and improvement. And so capping off the beginner's side of things, so if we're putting a timeline on it, less than a year of training, typically starting out at the 3 or 4 days a week in the gym is a pretty good spot. Definitely don't need to be doing 5 or more the first time you walk into the gym.
I don't even think you need to be doing 4 at that point.
No, you don't need to be doing 4.
Because this also comes back to recovery. So if you don't recover very well, which it's normal for beginners not to, then you might start with 2 days a week. Yeah. You might start with 2 to 3 days. Right. I think that you can still see a good amount of change at 3 days a week.
Right.
Less than 3.
As a beginner, sure.
Yeah, we're working more on foundational stuff and we're working on your recovery. But I think people can see the most changes as a beginner in that 3-day period.
Absolutely. And that's typically what I would start somebody brand new with. And you can ramp things up. The reason I say 3 or 4 is because I know a lot of people get into the gym and they want to go more frequently.
Some people don't want to be capped at
they want to build more of a consistent routine with it. I get that. It's not to say that you can't work out more frequently, but from an actual adaptation standpoint, 3 or 4 is going to be plenty when you're brand new.
Oh, absolutely.
And less than that, 2, you're really kind of pushing the limit as to what you can get out of that. That's kind of more of a range that I would put somebody if they are super constrained on time and we're just trying to maintain something, because that's just not really enough frequency, even in the very beginning stages. Don't get me wrong, it's better than nothing, but if you're really
it also depends on where you came from and what your general activity level outside of the gym looks like.
Sure. But if you're really expecting a lot of progress, 2 is just, really not going to cut it.
Yeah. But I guess it depends on your definition of like a lot of progress or what we're looking for. But
a lot of progress. Yeah.
But I think 3 days a week is a good amount of time.
Starting point.
So
now if we're moving on to that next category, again, we're coming up with kind of arbitrary labels here. So like you've been training for like 1 to 4 years. We're going to call that intermediate for these current definitions. This is where you can be a little bit more frequent in the gym. So you've built a bit of a foundation. You're understanding how different exercises work. You know what different exercises feel like. And you've got a decent level of strength with all of the basics. This is where incorporating some new accessory movements can be really useful. You're giving your body another new stimulus, which can further add in new growth. Maybe you bump your training up to 4 or 5 days a week now. Totally fine with that. And that's not to say that you can't go higher than that, especially if you're on the tail end of that. If you've been training for 4 years, there's nobody out there that's saying you can't train 6 days a week.
It also depends on the intensity that you have during your workouts.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So if you're going, as hard as you possibly can 4 to 5 days a week and you can't add in a 6th day, then okay, great. Perfect.
Right.
But if you're, maybe worried a little bit about your recovery or you just like going to the gym, then add a 6th day. That's cool.
Right. And that's a really good point to bring up about these frequency talks, is that if you're training 4 days a week, the reason you would want to be training 4 days a week, unless we're talking about a scheduling constraint, is that you require those 3 days off to recover.
Yeah.
Based on the level of intensity that you're training. If you're training 4 days a week, you don't have a schedule constraint, and you're recovering much more quickly than that, and you're feeling fresh on those other days. It's not to say that you have to train on those, but if you're wanting to get more out of your training program,
again, we're talking about
you're going to want to train there
and moving forward towards a goal when we're talking here versus just maintaining or just, trying to have a general healthy life.
Right. So
if you're trying to move forward, then yes, you should always be pushing enough to require those days off, because again, if we're not pushing, then our body's not adapting and we're not making any changes.
Right. Your days
off. We
off.
can maintain, but we're not going to be, building strength or building muscle or maybe losing body fat or whatever.
Right. From a progression standpoint, your days off have a purpose. They shouldn't just kind of be there because they're there and you saw this workout in a magazine. You're either not training frequently enough, or the days that you're in the gym, they're not intense enough based on your recovery. So again, intermediate, 4 to 5 days a week, mix in some new assistance exercises, change some things up from time to time. Maybe you're throwing in new assistance work every 4 to 8 weeks, every couple months or so. Definitely not program hopping month to month or changing your workouts week to week, because you're not going to see that same benefit from the progressive overload with similar exercises. And so now getting into more advanced stages, so say you've been training 5 to 9, 10 years, you know what you're doing in the gym.
Yeah.
There's no question about it. You, at this point, if you've been doing things properly, have built enough of a physique for people to realize, like, you've been training for a while. Yeah, it shouldn't be a question at this point. And this is where more frequency matters. This is where more assistance exercise changes matter, because your body starts to adapt to things much more quickly. When you're imposing the same type of stimulus over and over again, your body starts to learn what to expect there. And your body is always doing as little as possible. So it's always trying to expend as little energy as possible. It's always trying to stay as comfortable as possible. And so when you get trained in these different movements, because you've been doing them for years and years, that's where your progress will start to stall out because your body has so readily adapted to it. And that's where the benefit of new assistance work and new frequency can come in.
Or changing other levels of intensity, like tempo or rest periods or training to failure, where you start adding in more complicated things.
Yeah, new intensity techniques, new ways of executing the exercises. So even if the exercise on paper is the same, but the way that you're executing it is different, like Alexa said, with a tempo, or maybe you're throwing in like band or chain work to do some accommodating resistance. All of that can be a brand new stimulus and incite some new growth for you.
Definitely.
And so finally, we're going to call 10 plus years veteran in the gym. There's no question that if you've been doing it right, you've got a rock solid foundation at this point. And this is 10 years of consistent training in a linear fashion. We're not talking about you worked out for 5-6 years when you were 20 and then you worked out a couple times in your 30s. Yeah. So we're talking about 10 years of consistent training. Maybe your squat went from 100 pounds to 500 pounds, whatever it may be. There's no question what you've done in this time. This is where your training can be hyper variable. So there's some guys that'll even train different workouts every single time they're in the gym with some semblance of overload in there. And so this is where you get into a little bit more advanced metrics than just changing the weight on the bar and trying to increase that week over week. That can still happen, but especially if you're looking at different exercises each time you're in the gym, one metric could be maybe overall volume. So we're looking at total sets per body part per week. Maybe we're looking at total time under tension per body part per day. So again, we're getting very granular now.
So would this also be like when it would be most appropriate for somebody to start doing like a 2-a-day?
Yeah, I mean, this is where that type of thing could come into play.
Makes more sense.
Yeah, and even in that like 5 to 9 year, I mean, even sooner than that, depending on where you're at. Again, it all comes back to frequency and recovery. So when we're talking about 2-a-days now, that's doubling up on our frequency, which is great from a growth standpoint if you can recover from it.
Exactly.
And so the kind of the unspoken piece to this whole thing is your nutrition. We're not going to dive into that in this episode, but nutrition is obviously one of the mainstays of your recovery, your sleep as well, stress, all that kind of stuff.
And then also working on mobility and recovery exercise and stretching and rolling and getting massages frequently and doing the things that are really going to take care of your muscles and how they work together.
So these are all the unspoken elements of what we're talking about here.
Recovery is the side that we're really not giving too many details about, but these things are all really contingent on recovery.
That's a good topic we should talk about in the future.
Have we not talked about
specific recovery? I don't think so.
I can't remember.
But yeah, so the more, basically, recap, the more advanced you get, the more necessary it is for all of these nuances, the more details you need to look at.
So basically it just gets way more complicated the more advanced you are.
Yeah.
And
if you're questioning how advanced you are, you're probably not that advanced.
Yeah.
Because it's not, there's not a point in your mind where you're like, oh, am I advanced? Am I a veteran? Am I intermediate? Whatever. Your body will tell you. You'll understand what these things feel like when you're at the top end of the training spectrum there. If you're somebody that's kind of been on and off and on and off again, we're talking about consistent time here. So if it's a year on, a year off, a year on, a year off, you're still in that intermediate phase. I don't care how many times you've repeated that process.
And that's where most people, I feel like, fall.
Yeah.
Is kind of in that intermediate because most people tend to be a little on and off just as life happens. And
absolutely. And there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. But you just have to understand when you're putting this plan together what it is that your body actually needs. You don't need 15 curl variations every 3 days of the week because you saw Ronnie Coleman do that back in 1998. So yeah, that's kind of a way to look at frequency overall based on how long you've been in the gym. And then briefly, I want to touch on just some of the common training splits that you might see.
This is the most important part, right?
Yeah. So this is talking about...
So we talked about how many days a week you might be training and what those exercises might look like. But what body parts would you specifically be training on each one of those days? is how you would set up your week.
Right. So your training split. So what would you do with like a beginner?
So with a beginner, again, these people were trying to teach how to use their whole body or, how to kind of connect their body and teach their own muscles how to work together to create functional movements. So like we said, we focus on those foundational exercises. So we're going to start with full body workouts a few times a week.
Yeah.
So that's in that 2 to 4 times per week range. But we're going to work basically your entire body every time. Well, or we're going to ask you to work your entire body every time you go to the gym.
Right.
Right. So you get a lot of work done. You burn a lot of calories. You teach your body parts how to work together. The downside to doing full body workouts, though, is that you might not really bring as much intensity to specific body parts. Or if there's a certain body part that you really like to focus on, you wouldn't get as much of that focus doing a full body routine.
Right. So if you're really trying to bring up your arms, then a full body routine makes that a lot more difficult, because if you're really doing full body training, you've got to be training all the major muscle groups of your body at once. And even if you wanted to tack on a bunch of arm volume at the end, you're going to be so overly taxed from the other work that you've already done in that session.
You might not get a lot out of
that
it.
It's not going to be nearly as effective as if you were just using a dedicated arm day, if we're talking about just pure arm growth in this situation. So that's where, as a beginner, I don't need a ton of focus on that, because any sort of stimulus on any muscle is going to cause a change.
Definitely.
Whereas when you're getting more advanced and more tenured in your training, you're going to need more of a focus in individual spots for these adaptations to occur.
Well, and I think after that, after you kind of get more comfortable with doing full body style training, then I think the next natural step is starting to split those groups up a bit, but still keeping muscle groups together, or some muscles grouped together.
Yeah.
So talking about like an upper lower split, or doing like a push pull style.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so that's where, so upper lower is just as it sounds. So we're doing the upper half of the body. So horizontal presses, horizontal pulls, vertical presses. So anything.
All of your upper body training.
Chest, back,
chest,
shoulders.
back, shoulders, arms.
Arms. Yeah, all that. And so one of the benefits of this is you can focus a little bit more on individual body parts, because you've got less that you've got to get done in a session. And you also have the ability to train each body part a little bit more frequently, because now, instead of doing maybe 3 full body sessions in a week that take you a day or two to recover from each time, now if we're doing an upper lower split, we could easily turn that into 4 sessions through the week, if not 6 sessions in the week, and get every muscle in twice or maybe even 3 times for a more advanced person.
Well, I think the most important thing is that you get to spend a little bit more time on each muscle.
Right.
And each muscle group.
Yeah.
And you're still, and in this upper lower, I mean, you still are getting a lot of calories burned in most cases, because you're still doing more compound movements. We're not necessarily isolating a lot of muscles, but still teaching the body parts how to work together. We've just split your body into the upper half and the lower half.
Right. So you're still not quite as much time to isolate individual body parts or lagging body parts as you would in a body part split. But overall, you're going to get a lot more frequency in. That's going to lead to a lot more growth, strength, and more calories burned. So a lot of benefits with that. And then similar to an upper-lower split would be a push-pull split.
Which I think you can get a little bit more out of if you feel comfortable mixing your upper and lower body.
Yeah, again, it depends on what you're going for. Part of what I didn't really mention with the upper-lower is that you can work antagonistic muscles. So push and pull, things that synergize well together. So if you're doing a bench press and then a barbell row, you're working in that same plane, and that can have really advantageous effects from a muscle growth standpoint, and just a mobility,
just a functional standpoint.
So that's
you're
really
keeping
good.
Things balanced.
And then on the push-pull side of things, so instead of breaking things up upper lower, we're breaking things up kind of like front to back. So now everything on the front side of your body that's a pressing muscle, we're going to do in a session. So bench press and squat would be paired together. And then a pulling session would be like pull-ups and deadlifts or hamstring movements with back work. And so these have those same added benefits, and even a little bit more so from a calorie burning standpoint, because it's kind of like with the full body exercises, we're getting a lot of really big muscle groups, both upper and lower, working together each session. So more calories being burned overall. And then you also have that benefit of increased frequency through the week, like the upper lower split, because you're able to focus on a few more muscles per session and still work them multiple times over the course of the week.
The other thing I think that's beneficial about a push-pull is that, and this differs between men and women, but there's always going to be muscle groups that are, how do I want to say? Larger? Not larger, but like, so for women, you're typically, I think, going to get a little bit more out of lower body exercises versus upper body. You might burn less calories doing upper body exercises because those muscle groups aren't as well developed. Where in men, it could be the opposite, or you could be a little bit more well balanced. But I think that when you do something like a push-pull, if you're always getting leg and arm exercises in together, you're going to be more efficient and you're going to get the most calories burned and the most work done versus separating into upper lower, where those lower body days might burn more calories for some people and the upper body days might not, and vice versa.
Well, a lot of girls, I feel like, don't put nearly as much of a focus on upper body work. So
they don't.
Having that push-pull element where you're getting your leg work in and some upper body work in
might be more effective for those clients.
Mold that together.
Yeah. Definitely. Well, and it's like, at the same time, not to say that that's necessarily a bad thing. You should always be balanced and you should always work all of your muscle groups. But there are going to be certain people who want to see certain muscles be more developed than in other people.
Right.
And that's okay.
Absolutely. And so that's what kind of leads us into the body part split, which is absolutely awesome for targeting individual muscles. So if you have a lagging body part, or something that you're really trying to bring up, the body part split allows you to really focus on that. So if you're doing a balanced body part split, you're hitting everything once in a week. And from an overall growth standpoint, that's not the greatest. You can absolutely see progress. There's no question about that. Body part splits still work. But if we're talking about...
I feel like it depends on the intensity per workout still, right?
Absolutely.
Like you can still see progress.
If we're talking about optimal muscle growth, there's no question that training at least twice a week, a body part twice a week, leads to more growth. And so body part splits work really well if you're trying to bring up one, maybe two body parts at a time, because what you can do is keep your body part split for the rest of your body that you're trying to kind of maintain where it's at. Train it once per week, and then whatever that specific body part is that you're really trying to focus on and bring up, you can then hit that twice per week, maybe even three times per week, depending on how large of a muscle group it is, while keeping everything else in that maintenance range, and really start to bring that up to be on par with everything else.
Absolutely. Yeah, and so I was going to ask a question. I lost it.
You don't remember.
I lost it.
And the one thing I will caution with that approach is while it is technically an imbalanced program because the muscle we're trying to bring up is out of balance, if your lagging body part is your chest or a pressing muscle, it's very common to see guys overdo that, guys especially, if they're really trying to bring their chest up and suddenly they're pressing 3 days a week and they're not doing nearly enough pulling exercises to compensate for that. And that leads to rounding of the shoulders,
creates muscle imbalances,
different impingement issues, muscle imbalances,
injuries. So you do have to keep in mind that when you're doing this, you should do a lot of research on it and make sure that you're setting yourself up for success. And you should also make sure that you're spending enough time training the opposite muscle group.
Right.
Not necessarily with as much intensity maybe, but at least working on maybe adding some extra accessories or just some things to balance out the heavy work that you're doing on the other muscle group.
Right. So these types of periods where you're heavily focused on one individual muscle have to be constrained to certain periods of time.
Yeah.
So this
you can't
is not
just
something,
work on your chest forever.
Right. You can't say, I'm going to work on my chest in 2019 and do that 3 times a week for 52
for the entire
weeks
year.
Because you will be an absolute mess by the end of that. You'll probably not even
You'll
be able
probably
to
get
press
injured.
by May.
Yeah.
So those types of workout schemes can work well for maybe 4 weeks, 8 weeks at max, I would say, before you really got to flip the script and start bringing up that antagonistic muscle group so that everything stays balanced there. But yeah, so those are kind of the common schemes you'll see. That's not to say that those are the only ones that you'll see, but knowing your pros and cons of each one, where you stack up, and then what your overall goals are is how you should be kind of guided to these things. And then another note to throw in there is if you've been sticking with one of these paradigms for quite a while, even if it's not necessarily quote unquote the best training split for you, you might want to switch to another one for maybe 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, just to give yourself a new stimulus. So if you've been doing a ton of body part split work or a ton of upper lower split work, maybe throw in a push pull split for 2 months and you'll be shocked at how different it feels.
Yes. Well, changing any of those variables can feel drastically different. And that's the whole point. Like the whole point of going over this stuff for you guys too is to show you that you shouldn't be doing the same thing forever, because eventually you're going to plateau and you're not going to see any more improvement or growth.
Right.
So if progress, whatever your goal happens to be, if progress is the goal, then you want to take a look at your program, what you're doing, and how to change those variables so that you can continue to put stress on your body in a way that's going to result in change.
Absolutely. So thank you guys for tuning in this week. If there is anything you'd like us to cover in the future, feel free to reach out to myself at HypertroFit.com. You can find Alexa at therootedrd.com, and we will see you guys again next week.
See you guys next week.